This is just a quick follow-up to the new moons of Saturn. When I went back and listened to the video, there were some cuts and splices, and the presentation sounded a little fragmented. I just wanted to emphasize the points that seem to have been cloudy. These new moons of Saturn were discovered after the new moons of Jupiter. New moons of Jupiter were discovered in 2018 at a time where we said the planet X was passing by Jupiter or underneath Jupiter. Now, the article that came out and explained these new retrograde, wrong direction, inclined orbits, a dozen moons around there, roughly a dozen, discovered, and in the article that highlighted these findings, they actually said these moons were spotted from a ground-based observatory in Hawaii, and that they were noticed as these people were looking for Planet 9. Well, the corridor where Jupiter is, or was in 2018, was completely opposite part of the sky than it supposedly spends most of its time in that part of the sky. And it's quite interesting that they were looking for these while looking for Planet X. Well, everybody knows, every major astronomer that has mapped this thing has placed an approach underneath the sun. So if you were a ground-based observatory looking for Planet X, like they said, Planet 9, that's what they said, not Planet X, then you would be looking south of Jupiter. You would looking to the southern skies of Jupiter. And that would explain why all of a sudden you would see a few new moons. And they didn't announce the discovery, make it public for quite some time, because they wanted to map every single moon's orbit and plot it out. And so the observations went on a little while till they can get a good estimation of these trajectories. Well, then it wasn't even a year later that they discovered another 20 moons, more than even Jupiter, around Saturn. Again, almost all of them retrograde, wrong direction, inclined orbits. Now, a fool would say that they're not related. You got 12 over here, 20 over here. Every single one of those 32 is at roughly the same inclined retrograde, and they're all newly discovered. Ta-da! What a coincidence. The article that there was a couple articles I was referring to, but when they put stuff in there, like how we did not find these moons, is the first message in a paragraph. We did not find these moons by putting our eyes to a telescope. That's pretty much what an opening sentence in one of the paragraphs read. It read just like that. It was not discovered this way. It was discovered that way. Well, it's funny because the moons around Jupiter were discovered this way. They put their eyes to an eyepiece and looked. Now, the bizarre thing about finding moons around Jupiter that we didn't know were there was that we sent space probes in and around and over and under and in orbit of Jupiter, and those space probes flying in and amongst those moons could not find them. But then all of a sudden, suddenly in 2018, they were there and observable from Earth. So that's kind of, you can't explain that away, really, other than there were new moons. They want you to believe they're newly discovered, have been there all this time. So, but any logical thinking person looking in the southern skies for Planet 9 pretty much was following Harrington's model, his orbital model. And that model made this thing cross under Saturn as well. So fascinating that not even the space probes we sent through Saturn saw these moons, and that they want you to believe have been there. The article was also filled with confusing statements, which I won't go into because they're confusing statements, and I kind of regret even reading them. But it sure seemed like somebody was trying to hint they were new moons, even though they were prevented from saying so. And again, a proposed orbit by an astronomer. We tracked that thing on that orbit. We did not come up with that orbit. Somebody else did. All we did is when we went to find evidence to debunk that orbit in the presence of a brown dwarf in that orbit, all we found was evidence to support that it's there. And based upon its location, we made subsequently hundreds of predictions of earthquakes and solar flares based solely upon the position of that object that doesn't exist. So, yeah, this thing came through the solar system, this brown dwarf. It's exiting the solar system. A lot of the inclines are between 30 and 40 degrees, which kind of gives you an idea of what the incline of the parent body may have been. Something passes by on your equatorial region, it's hard to imagine that you would capture so many objects that would not be in the equatorial regions. But again, it's really solid and consistent proof that we tracked this thing accurately, and that we called it accurately, and that the whole solar system has changed. And if there's new debris around those planets, there will soon be new debris around Uranus. There has to be new debris around Neptune, but that's very difficult to track. So there's no doubt that these astronomers with the same telescopes that found these new moons around Jupiter are going to see, well, let's take a look at Saturn now. And if this object tracked to Harrington's model, Saturn has to have new moons. It's just almost physically impossible for Saturn not to have new moons when this thing passed underneath Saturn first. So, and at that time, remember, they had some very bizarre anomalies taken by a private astronomer with their telescope, and it actually looked like electron discharge off the rings. So until next time, thanks for tuning in.